In the winter of 1944, as Germany unleashed the world's first operational jet fighter onto European skies, the Luftwaffe believed it had secured air superiority through technological supremacy alone. The Messerschmitt Me 262, capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, seemed untouchable. Yet within months, a twin-boomed American fighter, mockingly called the fork-tailed devil by German command, would exploit a vulnerability so obvious it had been hiding in plain sight. Every jet, no matter how fast, must eventually slow down to land. February 18, 1945, Akmer Airfield, northwest Germany. The radio crackled first. "Gear down! Forktails above the sun!" Lieutenant Klaus Brandt barely registered the panic in the controller's voice. He was 300 feet from touchdown, throttles pulled back. The Messerschmitt Me 262's twin Jumo turbines winding down from their characteristic shriek to a manageable rumble. The runway stretched ahead like a gray ribbon through the snow. Home. Safety. Then the world tilted. The P-38 Lightning came out of nowhere. No, not nowhere. It had been there all along, perched at 12,000 feet, patient as a hunting owl, waiting for this exact moment. The twin-boom silhouette dropped through a shaft of winter sunlight, descending at an angle that seemed impossible. Too steep, too fast. But the geometry was perfect. Brandt saw the nose flash. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all clustered in the fighter's nose, converged their fire into a stream no wider than a dinner plate. The burst lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. The shells walked up the 262's right wing route, punching through aluminum skin that had been designed to withstand stress, not concentrated firepower at point-blank range. The jet bucked. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the canopy in a fine mist, turning the windscreen amber. Brandt hauled back on the stick by instinct, trying to abort, trying to climb out of the trap. The engines surged. Too late. The gear was down. The flaps were extended. The jet had been configured for landing, not combat. It was a racehorse wearing leg irons. The 262 yawed hard right, skidded off the runway, and carved a black scar through the frozen mud before coming to rest against a maintenance truck. Brandt sat in the cockpit, breathing hard, uninjured but finished. Through the shattered canopy, he watched the P-38 climb away in a smooth, arcing zoom, its twin engines roaring defiance. No victory roll, no showboating, just altitude. The Lightning disappeared into the glare, and Brandt realized something cold and undeniable. The fork had just eaten Germany's finest. The debriefing room at Akmer smelled of stale cigarette smoke and burned coffee. Maps covered the walls, pins marking Allied bomber routes and known fighter bases. But the newest addition, a single red circle around the airfield itself, felt like an accusation. Major Erich Steiner stood at the head of the table, jaw tight. He was Luftwaffe through and through, a veteran of Poland and France, a man who believed in discipline, precision, and the superiority of German engineering. The Me 262 had been his pride. Now it felt like a liability. 4 jets lost this week, Steiner said quietly. All in the traffic pattern, all to P-38s. The room stayed silent. Brandt slouched in his chair, still wearing his flight suit, still smelling of hydraulic fluid. Across the table sat Hauptmann Werner Adler, the squadron's top ace with 11 confirmed kills. Adler's expression was unreadable. "They're calling it the flying fork," someone muttered from the back of the room. Nervous laughter rippled through the pilots. Steiner didn't smile. "They can call it whatever they want, it's killing us." The nickname had started weeks earlier, a piece of propaganda meant to diminish the enemy. The P-38's twin-boom design looked awkward, ungainly, like a farm implement that had wandered into a dogfight. German pilots had laughed at the designation. Fork-tailed devil. Flying fork. A joke. A curiosity. But jokes don't shoot down jets. Steiner tapped the map. "The Americans aren't engaging us in the air anymore. They're not chasing, they're waiting. They've identified our vulnerability and they're exploiting it with surgical precision." Brandt spoke up, voice hoarse. "They hit us in the pattern. When we're slow, when we're committed." "Exactly." Steiner's finger traced a circle around the airfield. The The P-38 doesn't need to outrun the 262. It just needs to be in the right place at the right moment. And they are. Every single time. Adler leaned forward. So we change our approach patterns, randomize altitudes, vary our timing. We've tried, Steiner replied. They adapt faster than we do. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Somewhere across the English Channel, American intelligence officers were feeding targeting data to fighter groups with ruthless efficiency. Somewhere over Germany, P-38 pilots were learning a new kind of warfare. Not the romantic dogfight of spinning aircraft and desperate maneuvers, but something colder, clinical, mathematical. Brandt closed his eyes and saw it again. The lightning dropping through the sun, the nose flash, the inevitability of it. He had been flying the fastest fighter in the world, and it hadn't mattered. Speed was supposed to be salvation. Instead, it had become a trap. The Me-262 could outrun anything in the sky, but only when it had energy, altitude, momentum. On final approach, gear down and dirty, the jet was just another airplane. Slow, predictable, vulnerable. They're teaching us a lesson, Brandt said quietly. Steiner looked at him. What lesson? That the war doesn't reward the beautiful turn. It rewards the pilot who controls energy, timing, and the window. Outside, engines roared as another 262 prepared for takeoff. Brandt wondered if the P-38s were already up there, circling, patient as wolves. Waiting for the inevitable return, waiting for the moment when speed became weakness. The fork was hungry, and the jets kept landing. December 1944. The war had entered its cruelest phase, where hope and desperation existed in equal measure. For Germany, the Me-262 represented a technological Hail Mary, a weapon so advanced it might reverse the tide of inevitable defeat. For the Allies, it represented a problem that needed solving before it became unsolvable. At RAF Huntington, 300 miles across the North Sea, Captain Raymond Harris stood in front of a blackboard covered in diagrams. He was 32 years old, a P-38 squadron leader with 17 confirmed kills, and a reputation for methodical precision that bordered on obsession. His pilots called him the professor behind his back. He took it as a compliment. The briefing room was packed. 18 pilots, most of them younger than Harris by a decade, sat in folding chairs with notepads open. On the blackboard, Harris had drawn the outline of a Me-262 in profile, with annotations marking its speed envelope, acceleration curve, and fuel consumption rate. Gentlemen, Harris began, the Messerschmitt 262 is faster than us. It climbs better than us. In a straight-line chase, it will leave us behind every single time. He paused, which is why we will never chase it. Murmurs rippled through the room. Lieutenant Bobby Crane, a Texan with 12 kills and a cowboy's confidence, raised his hand. Sir, if we don't chase them, how do we kill them? Harris smiled thinly. We don't kill them in the air, Lieutenant. We kill them on the ground. Or rather, we kill them in the 30 seconds between air and ground. He turned back to the blackboard and drew a simple diagram, a runway, an approach path, and a curved line representing altitude loss. The Me-262 needs a long runway. Its engines spool up slowly. Its landing gear can't handle rough fields. That means every jet base in Germany has a predictable traffic pattern, and every pilot flying that jet must eventually commit to a landing approach where his speed drops below 200 knots. Harris circled the approach path. This is the window. This is where the fork eats. The room went quiet. The pilots weren't stupid. They understood what Harris was proposing. Not aerial combat, but aerial ambush. Predation. It went against every instinct drilled into them during training, where victory meant outmaneuvering the enemy in a fair fight. But this wasn't about fair. This was about mathematics. How do we get into position without getting shredded by flak? Crane asked. We don't orbit the airfield, Harris replied. We position ourselves 10 miles out, at altitude, along the approach corridor. We wait for the spotter call. We calculate the intercept geometry, and we make one pass. 1. If we miss, we climb out and reset. No chasing, no lingering. The flak will kill us if we get greedy. He tapped the blackboard. The P-38 has two advantages the Me-262 doesn't: stability and firepower concentration. Our twin-boom design keeps us rock steady in a dive. Our nose-mounted guns put everything on target without convergence issues. We don't need a long burst. 2 seconds at the right angle will gut a jet. Harris pulled out another diagram, this one showing dive angles and energy states. When the jet is on final approach, it's low, slow, and committed. It can't dodge. It can't accelerate quickly enough to escape. If we position ourselves correctly, we're diving with maximum energy while they're bleeding energy to land. It's not a dogfight. It's geometry. The briefing continued for another hour. Harris walked them through every detail: radio protocols, fuel management, abort criteria, mutual support tactics. He emphasized discipline above all else. The Me-262 pilots were good. Some of them were excellent. They would try to bait the P-38s into chasing them away from the airfield, into a stern chase where the jet's speed advantage would turn the hunter into the hunted. Do not follow them, Harris repeated. Do not chase. The moment you enter a stern chase, you've lost. The 262 wants you to play its game. We play ours. As the pilots filed out, Harris remained at the blackboard, staring at the diagrams. He thought about Klaus Brandt, whom he'd never met but whose aircraft he'd crippled 3 days earlier. He thought about the desperation in the German radio chatter, the panic when the call went out. Fork tails above the sun. The nickname amused him. Flying Fork. It was meant as an insult, but Harris heard something else in it. Fear. The Germans were afraid of the wrong thing. They feared the P-38's appearance, its awkward shape, its lack of grace. They should have feared its patience. Across the Reich, the Luftwaffe command struggled with a problem that couldn't be solved by engineering alone. The Me-262 was a masterpiece of aerodynamics and propulsion, a glimpse of the future delivered too late to matter. But every masterpiece had weaknesses, and the Americans had found the seam. Oberst Victor Mann, chief of jet fighter operations, stood in his office at Rechlin and read the latest loss reports. 4 jets destroyed on approach in the past week. 2 pilots killed, 3 wounded. The numbers were small, statistically insignificant in the broader context of the war. But the trend was undeniable. The P-38s weren't getting lucky. They were executing a plan. Mann picked up the telephone and called his counterpart at OKL headquarters in Berlin. We need to disperse the jet bases, he said without preamble. Smaller fields, shorter runways. The voice on the other end was patient, condescending. The 262 requires a minimum runway length of 1,800 meters. Shorter fields aren't an option. Then we need better flak coverage around the approach corridors. We've tripled the 88mm batteries at every jet base. It hasn't stopped them. Mann slammed his fist on the desk. Then what do you suggest? We're losing jets on the ground faster than we can replace them. Silence on the line. Then, win the war faster. The call ended. Mann sat alone in his office, staring at the map on his wall. Red pins marked every known Me-262 base. He imagined American intelligence officers staring at the same map, drawing circles, calculating intercept times. The Fork was coming, and there was nowhere left to hide. Meanwhile, at Akmer, Klaus Brandt walked the flight line at dusk. His replacement jet sat on the hardstand, sleek and menacing, its nose painted with the Black Panther emblem of his squadron. He ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the cold metal beneath his palm. The aircraft was a miracle. It could reach 600 kilometers per hour in level flight. It could climb like an eagle and strike like lightning, but it couldn't land safely anymore, not with the Forks circling overhead. Brandt thought about Harris, the American pilot he'd never seen but whose tactics he'd studied through debriefing reports. Harris wasn't a showman. He didn't try fancy maneuvers or risky head-on passes. He simply positioned himself in the right place and waited for the inevitable moment when physics turned against the jet. Energy, timing, the window. Brandt understood now. The war didn't reward confidence, it rewarded calculation, and the Americans had done the math. February 22, 1945. The revelation came not in a single moment, but in a series of realizations, each one building on the last until the truth became inescapable. Harris stood on the tarmac at first light, watching his ground crew prep the P-38s. The twin booms gleamed in the pale morning sun, frost still clinging to the metal surfaces. Each aircraft carried 400 gallons of fuel in internal tanks, plus 2 300-gallon drop tanks slung beneath the wings. Range, over 1,400 miles. Endurance, enough to loiter for hours above enemy territory, waiting. The P-38 Lightning had been designed as a long-range escort fighter, built to shepherd bombers deep into Germany and back again. But Harris had realized something the designers perhaps hadn't intended. Endurance was a weapon. The ability to wait was as valuable as the ability to fight. He walked to his aircraft and ran through the pre-flight inspection. The Allison engines were reliable, powerful, and thirsty. The twin-boom configuration meant redundancy. Lose one engine and you could still fly home. The tricycle landing gear made takeoffs and landings easier than conventional tail draggers. And the nose armament, 4 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns and 1 Hispano 20mm cannon, delivered concentrated firepower without the convergence problems that plagued wing-mounted guns. The Americans hadn't built a dogfighter. They'd built a precision instrument. By 800 hours, Harris and his flight of 4 P-38s were airborne, climbing through broken clouds toward their patrol altitude of 15,000 feet. The briefing had been simple: vector to the Rhine-Hopsten area, establish a combat air patrol pattern along the known approach corridor, and wait for the spotter's call. No heroics, no improvisation, just discipline. The radio crackled. Kingfish lead, this is Watchtower. 2 bandits inbound to Hopsten from the northeast. Angels 8 descending. Harris keyed his mic. Kingfish copies, moving to intercept position. He didn't chase the jets. He didn't even turn toward them. Instead, he calculated. The Me-262s were 8,000 feet up and descending. Their approach speed would be around 200 knots, maybe less as they configured for landing. If Harris positioned his flight 5 miles west of the field at 15,000 feet, the geometry would work itself out. The jets would come to him. 3 minutes passed. The winter sun climbed higher, throwing long shadows across the German countryside below. Harris scanned the sky, eyes moving in a practiced pattern. High, low, left, right. Check 6. Nothing. Then he saw them. 2 dark specks against the pale clouds, descending in a shallow left-hand turn toward the airfield. The Me-262s were configured for landing. Gear down, flaps extended, speed bleeding off with every second. They looked graceful from this distance, almost delicate. Beautiful machines caught in an ugly war. Harris rolled inverted and pulled through, converting his altitude advantage into kinetic energy. The P-38 accelerated smoothly, the dive angle steep but controlled. The airframe shuddered slightly as he passed 300 knots, then steadied. The dive flaps, a late-war modification, kept the nose from tucking under as compressibility effects built up. The first Me-262 grew larger in his gun sight. The pilot hadn't seen him yet. Why would he? The approach was supposed to be safe. The landing was supposed to be routine. Harris pressed the trigger. The nose of the P-38 erupted in flame and smoke. The 50 caliber rounds walked up the jet's right wing, stitching a line of holes through aluminum skin. The 20mm cannon shells followed a fraction of a second later, exploding on impact. One shell hit the wing root. Another punched through the fuselage just behind the cockpit. The burst lasted 2 seconds. Harris released the trigger and pulled hard, zooming back up to altitude. G-forces pressed him into his seat. The P-38 climbed eagerly, trading speed for height, escaping the inevitable flak that would saturate the area within seconds. Behind him, the Me-262 staggered. Black smoke poured from the damaged wing. The pilot tried to abort the landing, pushing the throttles forward, but the response was sluggish. The jet yawed right, overcorrected left, and slammed into the ground short of the runway threshold. It tumbled twice before exploding in a fireball that sent debris spinning across the frozen field. Harris didn't watch. He was already climbing, already looking for threats, already repositioning for the next engagement. Altitude first. Always altitude. The second Me-262 had seen the attack. Its pilot firewalled the throttles and pulled up hard, abandoning the approach. The jet accelerated rapidly, climbing away from the field at a steep angle. It was fast, impossibly fast. Within seconds, it was out of range, pulling away from the P-38s like they were standing still. Harris didn't chase. He keyed the radio. Kingfish flight. Reform on me. Climb to Angels 20. Reset for the next pass. Lieutenant Crane's voice came back, breathless. Lead, that bandit's running. We can catch him if we… Negative, Harris interrupted. Let him go. He's out of the window. We wait for the next one. The philosophy was simple but counterintuitive. Every instinct in a fighter pilot's body screamed to pursue a fleeing enemy, to press the advantage, to chase until the kill was confirmed. But chasing was how you died. Chasing meant entering the enemy's energy envelope, where the Me-262's speed advantage turned the predator into prey. Chasing meant burning fuel you couldn't afford to waste. Chasing meant abandoning position and giving up the one advantage the P-38 had: patience. Harris had learned this lesson the hard way months earlier, when he'd pursued an FW-190 into a flak trap and barely escaped with his life. The war rewarded calculation, not courage. It rewarded pilots who understood that every engagement was a math problem with variables that could be manipulated. Altitude, speed, angle, timing, position. Control the variables, control the outcome. By noon, Harris had flown 3 more sorties. Each one followed the same pattern. Loiter at altitude, wait for the spotter's call, position for the intercept, execute one pass, climb out, reset. No chasing, no lingering, clinical, methodical. Boring even, except for the moments when the trigger was pressed and the world exploded in tracer fire and smoke. 2 more jets damaged, 1 destroyed. 3 pilots had ejected successfully. 1 hadn't. The numbers were adding up, not just for Harris, but for every P-38 squadron executing the same tactics across Germany. The kill-to-loss ratio was staggering. For every P-38 shot down by flak or enemy fighters, 5 Me-262s were destroyed in the traffic pattern. The math didn't lie. The jets were faster. The jets were more advanced. The jets represented the future of aviation. But the future still had to land. That evening, back at Honington, Harris sat in the debriefing room and filled out his after-action report. The intelligence officer, a captain named Morrison, leaned over his shoulder and read the kill description. "You make it sound easy," Morrison said. Harris shook his head. "It's not easy. It's just inevitable. If you control the variables, the outcome is predetermined. And if the Germans figure out how to change the variables..." Harris looked up. "Then we change ours. But right now, they're trapped. The Me-262 needs long runways. Long runways mean predictable approach patterns. Predictable patterns mean we know where they'll be and when. As long as those constants remain, the window stays open." Morrison nodded slowly. "The fork keeps eating. The fork keeps eating." Harris agreed. Across the Reich, Klaus Brandt sat in the operations room at Achmer and stared at the mission board. His name was listed for the morning sortie: Combat Air Patrol over the Ruhr. Launch time, 0600 hours. Expected duration, 90 minutes. Return time, 0730 hours. Return time. The phrase felt like a taunt. Returning meant landing. Landing meant vulnerability. And vulnerability meant the forks would be waiting. He thought about Harris again. The American had turned warfare into arithmetic. Energy plus position plus timing equaled death. There was no artistry in it, no honor, no chance for the kind of heroic individual combat that had defined air warfare since 1914. Just cold calculation. Brandt wondered if this was the future. Not jet engines and swept wings and rocket-powered interceptors, but this. The systematic exploitation of weakness, the reduction of combat to probabilities and vectors. War is an engineering problem. He decided he preferred the past. But the past was gone, buried under the rubble of 1,000 German cities, and the future was a P-38 diving out of the sun with its guns already firing. March 1945. The collapse began not with a single catastrophic defeat, but with 1,000 small cuts, each one drawing blood, each one eroding confidence, until the psychological foundation crumbled. At Rechlin, Oberst Victor Mann convened an emergency meeting of jet squadron commanders. The conference room was sparse, utilitarian, heated by a single wood-burning stove that barely kept the cold at bay. Outside, snow fell in thick sheets, covering the airfield in white silence. Inside, the atmosphere was equally frozen. Mann stood at the head of the table, a sheaf of loss reports in his hand. His face was gray with exhaustion. "Gentlemen, in the past 3 weeks we have lost 42 Me-262s. 31 of those losses occurred in the traffic pattern. Most were destroyed by P-38s. The squadron commanders exchanged glances. Major Steiner spoke first. "We've implemented variable approach patterns. We've increased flak coverage. We've tried dawn and dusk launches to exploit low sun angles. Nothing works. Because they're not fighting us," another commander said bitterly. "They're hunting us. Like animals." Mann nodded slowly. "Intelligence reports indicate the Americans have forward observers positioned near every jet base. They're using radio triangulation to track our launches and returns. By the time our pilots enter the traffic pattern, the P-38s are already in position. Altitude, angle, timing, all optimized. They've turned combat into a science." Hauptmann Werner Adler, still undefeated in air-to-air combat, leaned forward. "Then we fight them in the air. We engage them at altitude, before we commit to landing." "With what fuel?" Steiner shot back. "The 262 burns through its tanks in 30 minutes of combat flight. If we extend the mission to engage P-38s at altitude, we won't have enough fuel to reach an alternate field if the approach is compromised. We'll be forced to land regardless. And that's exactly when they'll kill us." The room fell silent. The truth was inescapable. The Me-262's performance came at a cost. The Jumo engines were thirsty, temperamental, prone to flame out if handled roughly. The jet could outrun anything in the sky, but only for a short time. After that, physics and fuel consumption forced every pilot to make the same choice: land or die. The P-38 pilots understood this. They'd done the math. They knew the Me-262's combat radius, its fuel consumption curve, its maximum loiter time. They positioned themselves accordingly and waited for the inevitable moment when the jets had no choice but to descend. Mann placed the reports on the table. "The High Command has ordered us to prioritize jet production. We're expected to field 300 operational Me-262s by summer, but at our current loss rate, we'll be replacing aircraft faster than we can train pilots to fly them." "Then train them faster," someone muttered. "Train them to do what?" Adler's voice was sharp. "Avoid landing? The problem isn't skill, it's geometry. The Americans have solved the equation. As long as we need runways, they have a target." Mann looked around the table. These were his best men, veterans of campaigns stretching back to Poland and France, survivors of the Eastern Front's meat grinder. They were exhausted, under-equipped, fighting a war that was already lost. And now they were being asked to solve a problem that had no solution within the existing constraints. "We need shorter runways," Mann said finally. "Or rocket-assisted takeoffs or something that breaks the pattern." Steiner shook his head. "With respect, Oberst, we don't have time for engineering miracles. The war will be over before we can redesign the 262's landing gear." Meanwhile, across the English Channel, Captain Raymond Harris was discovering the limits of his own strategy. The Germans were adapting. Slowly, imperfectly, but adapting nonetheless. The first sign came on March 8th, when Harris led a flight to intercept jets returning to Brandenburg-Brest. The spotter had called in 3 bandits inbound from the east, low on fuel, committed to landing. Harris positioned his flight perfectly, 15,000 feet, 5 miles west, sun at their backs. The geometry was flawless. But when the Me-262s entered the traffic pattern, they didn't follow the standard left-hand approach. Instead, they split up, each jet taking a different vector, varying altitude and speed unpredictably. One came in high and fast, diving for the runway at the last possible moment. Another circled wide, forcing Harris to choose between maintaining position or repositioning for a lower probability shot. Harris chose to maintain position. The high, fast jet landed successfully. The other 2 were forced to abort when Harris's wingman made a single passing attack, damaging one jet's landing gear. Both jets diverted to alternate fields. No kills, one damaged. Not a disaster, but not the clean execution Harris had grown accustomed to. The debriefing was tense. "They're learning," Lieutenant Crane said, "faster than we expected." Harris nodded. "They're introducing chaos into the pattern. Multiple vectors, variable speeds, unpredictable timing. It makes our intercept geometry harder to calculate." "So what do we do?" Harris stared at the map on the wall, thinking. The P-38's advantage had always been patience and predictability. But if the enemy stopped being predictable, the advantage narrowed. Not eliminated. Harris was certain of that, but narrowed. "We adapt," he said finally. 2 ship elements instead of 4 ship flights. Cover more approach vectors simultaneously. One element engages, the other maintains overwatch. If they split up, we split up. If they introduce chaos, we introduce discipline. The war had become a game of moves and counter-moves, each side probing for weakness, each adjustment triggering a counter-adjustment. The Germans couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Jets still needed to land, but they could make the solution more expensive, more dangerous, more uncertain. On March 15th, Harris nearly died. He had positioned his element north of Parchim Airfield, waiting for a single Mi-262 that intelligence reported was low on fuel and unable to reach an alternate base. The jet appeared right on schedule, descending through broken clouds at 8,000 feet. Harris rolled into the attack, diving smoothly. Airspeed building, gun sight tracking the target perfectly. Then the flak opened up. Not the usual pattern of 88mm shells bursting at predictable altitudes, but a curtain of fire that seemed to anticipate his dive angle. Tracers crisscrossed the sky in a deadly web. A shell exploded 50 feet to his left, close enough that shrapnel peppered the P-38's right boom. Another burst directly ahead, forcing Harris to brake hard right and abandon the attack. He pulled out at 4,000 feet, ears ringing, heart hammering. The Mi-262 landed safely. Back at Honington, Harris examined the damage to his aircraft. 3 shrapnel holes in the boom, 1 in the vertical stabilizer. Close. Too close. The Germans had repositioned their flak batteries to cover the most likely dive vectors. They'd studied the P-38 attacks and adjusted their defensive fire accordingly. Morrison found Harris in the hangar, staring at the damaged boom. "You were lucky." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Harris said quietly. "They did the math too. They calculated where we'd be and when. We're not the only ones who can think geometrically. Does that change your approach?" Harris thought about it. "It changes the variables, but not the equation. They still have to land. We still have altitude and patience. The window is smaller now, more dangerous, but it's still there." He ran his hand along the shrapnel holes. "They're making us pay for every kill. That's smart, but payment isn't the same as prevention. As long as the jets need runways, we have a mission." In Germany, Klaus Brandt flew his last combat sortie on March 18th. The mission was routine: intercept Allied bombers over Magdeburg, engage if possible, return to Akmar. He'd flown variations of this mission dozens of times. He knew what to expect. The bombers were there, a formation of B-17s crawling across the sky at 25,000 feet, surrounded by a cloud of escort fighters. Brandt climbed to intercept, his Mi-262 slicing through the thin air with casual ease. He made one firing pass, damaging a bomber's No. 3 engine, then broke away before the escorts could react. The return flight was textbook. Fuel state, adequate. Weather, clear. Approach vector, standard left-hand pattern from the west. He called the tower. Akmar Tower, Panther 2-3, requesting landing clearance. The response came immediately. Panther 2-3 cleared to land runway 27. Be advised. Enemy fighters reported in the area. Brandt's blood went cold. The forks. They were here, waiting. He scanned the sky above and behind, eyes moving frantically across the empty blue expanse. Nothing. But they were there. He knew they were there. Somewhere high and patient, calculating the geometry, waiting for him to commit. He had no choice. His fuel was too low to divert. The jet was too heavy to climb and fight. He was already in the window, and the window was closing. Brandt lowered the landing gear and extended the flaps. The jet slowed obediently, configuring itself for landing. The runway stretched ahead like a promise. 300 meters. 200. The P-38 came from the northwest, diving out of a cloud bank he'd dismissed as empty. The attack was perfect. High deflection angle, maximum energy, guns firing before Brandt even saw the tracers. The burst hit his left engine nacelle, shredding the turbine blades. The engine exploded in a shower of metal fragments. Brandt ejected at 200 feet, barely clearing the disintegrating aircraft. He landed hard in a frozen field, watching his jet cartwheel across the runway in a cascade of flame and debris. From the ground, he saw the P-38 climb away, its twin booms silhouetted against the pale sky. No victory roll, no celebration, just altitude. The fork had eaten well. The lesson crystallized in the final weeks of the war, when the outcome was no longer in doubt, and the only questions remaining were about costs and consequences. Captain Raymond Harris sat in the officers' club at Honington, nursing a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. Around him, pilots celebrated another successful mission, their voices loud with relief and exhaustion. 18 P-38s had launched that morning. 17 had returned. 3 Me-262s destroyed, 2 damaged. The mathematics continued to favor the hunters, but Harris felt no joy in the arithmetic. He'd spent 3 months perfecting a method of killing that required no courage, no artistry, only patience and precision. He'd turned air combat into an engineering problem and solved it with ruthless efficiency. The solution worked. That was indisputable. But working and being right weren't the same thing. Lieutenant Crane dropped into the chair beside him. "You should be celebrating, Captain." "We're winning." "We're not winning," Harris said quietly. "We're just losing slower than they are." Crane frowned. "That's what winning is, isn't it? In a war like this?" Harris finally took a sip of whiskey. The burn felt appropriate. The Me-262 was supposed to change everything. It was faster, more advanced, more capable than anything we had. On paper, it should have dominated the skies. But it didn't. You know why? Because we figured out how to kill it. No, Harris shook his head. Because they built a weapon that solved the wrong problem. They focused on speed and altitude and technological superiority. They built a fighter that could outrun anything in the sky. But they forgot that every flight ends the same way, on the ground. And on the ground, speed means nothing. He set the glass down. We didn't beat the Me-262 with better technology. We beat it with better thinking. We identified the constraint they couldn't eliminate, the need to land. And we exploited it. They were trapped by their own design. Crane considered this. So the lesson is what? That technology isn't enough? The lesson is that wars aren't won by the side with the best weapons. They're won by the side that understands the problem most clearly. Harris gestured toward the window, where the P-38 sat on the hardstand. Look at our aircraft. It's not as fast as the 262. It's not as advanced, but it has endurance, stability, redundancy, range. It was designed to solve a specific problem, escort bombers deep into enemy territory and bring them home. And because it solved that problem well, it could be adapted to solve other problems. He paused. The Germans built a weapon to win dogfights. We built a weapon to win a war. That's the difference. Across the Reich, in a makeshift hospital near what remained of Akmer Airfield, Klaus Brandt lay in a bed with 3 cracked ribs and a concussion. Through the window, he could hear the sound of engines. American engines, probably P-47s on a ground attack mission. The front was collapsing, the war was ending, and Brandt was alive, which felt like both a mercy and a punishment. Major Steiner visited him that evening. The older man looked hollowed out, aged a decade in a matter of weeks. He pulled up a chair and sat heavily. "How do you feel?" Steiner asked. "Like I lost," Brandt said. Steiner nodded. "We all did. The question is whether we learned anything in the losing." Brandt thought about the P-38 diving out of the clouds, the precision of the attack, the inevitability of it. "We built the fastest fighter in the world," he said slowly. "And it didn't matter, because the Americans never fought us on our terms. They chose the battlefield. They chose the timing. They made us fight where we were weakest. They were smarter than us, Steiner said simply. Not braver, not more skilled, just smarter. They understood that war is a system, not a series of individual contests. And in a system, you don't need to win every engagement. You just need to control the variables that matter. Brandt closed his eyes. He thought about all the training he'd received, all the emphasis on individual skill and courage and aggressive tactics. He thought about the Luftwaffe's tradition of the ace, the lone wolf, the hero who won through personal excellence. And he realized that tradition had been a luxury, something that worked when you had material superiority and strategic initiative. When those advantages evaporated, the tradition became a liability. The Americans didn't care about honor, Brandt said. They cared about winning. Yes, Steiner agreed. And they defined winning correctly, not as individual glory but as systematic destruction of our ability to fight. They turned our greatest strength, the Me-262, into a trap. Every time we launched one, we knew it would have to land eventually, and every landing was a potential death sentence. He stood slowly, joints creaking. The future of air warfare won't be decided by dogfights between aces. It will be decided by planning staffs calculating fuel ranges and approach vectors, by intelligence officers tracking airfield locations, by engineers designing weapons that can be mass-produced and easily maintained. The romantic era is over, Klaus. We just didn't realize it until we'd already lost. After Steiner left, Brandt stared at the ceiling and contemplated the arithmetic of defeat. The Me-262 had been a miracle of engineering, a weapon that showcased German technical brilliance. But brilliance wasn't enough. The jet had been designed in isolation, as if warfare were a technical problem rather than a human system embedded in logistics, geography, fuel supply, runway availability, and 1,000 other unglamorous constraints. The Americans had understood the system. They'd looked at the Me-262 and asked not, how do we outfly it, but what does it need to survive? And the answer was simple. Long runways, skilled pilots, adequate fuel, predictable approach patterns. Control those elements, and the jet's speed became irrelevant. They were defeated not by weapons, but by arithmetic. In London, at Allied Intelligence Headquarters, analysts compiled the final statistics of the jet fighter campaign. The numbers told a story that would be studied by military strategists for decades to come. Me-262s produced 1,430, Me-262s operational at any given time, approximately 200 Me-262s lost in combat, 100 Me-262s lost to mechanical failure, 80 Me-262s lost on the ground to bombing, 200 Me-262s destroyed during takeoff or landing by Allied fighters, 150, the P-38. Lightning accounted for roughly half of those 150 kills, not through superior performance, but through superior positioning. Not through technological advantage, but through psychological understanding. The German pilots had been trained to think of air combat as a test of skill and courage. The American pilots had been trained to think of it as a problem with solutions. Captain Morrison, the intelligence officer who'd worked most closely with Harris, wrote the after-action summary. His conclusion was blunt. The Me-262 campaign demonstrates that technological superiority is a necessary but insufficient condition for military success. The German jet fighter possessed performance characteristics that should have guaranteed air superiority. However, systemic vulnerabilities, primarily the requirement for long, prepared runways and the predictability of landing patterns, were systematically exploited by Allied forces using existing aircraft and tactical innovations. The lesson is clear. In modern warfare, the side that best understands the operational system will defeat the side with the best individual weapons. The report was classified and filed away. Morrison doubted anyone would read it. The war was ending. Everyone wanted to celebrate, not contemplate the uncomfortable implications of how victory had been achieved. But Harris read it, and he understood what Morrison was really saying. They had won by being less romantic and more ruthless. They had won by refusing to fight the war the enemy wanted to fight. They had won by turning courage into a liability and patience into a weapon. It wasn't a lesson that made anyone feel heroic, but it was a lesson that would define the future of warfare. On April 15, 1945, Harris flew his last combat mission. By then, organized Luftwaffe resistance had collapsed. The Me-262 bases were overrun or abandoned. The jets that remained were grounded for lack of fuel. The Fork had nothing left to eat. Harris circled the ruins of Akmer Airfield at 10,000 feet, looking down at the cratered runways and burned-out hangars. Somewhere down there, Klaus Brandt was probably still recovering from his ejection. Harris would never know his name, never meet him, never learn that they'd both reached the same conclusion from opposite sides of the war, that combat had become a science, and science favored the side that controlled the most variables. The war ended 3 weeks later. Harris returned to America with a Distinguished Flying Cross and a reputation as one of the most effective P-38 pilots in the European theater. He never told anyone that his success had come not from skill but from patience, not from courage but from calculation. The Fork had eaten well, but it had never been hungry. It had simply been methodical, and in the end, method defeated speed. 60 years later, in a small museum outside Munich, an elderly man stood before a restored Messerschmitt Me-262. The aircraft gleamed under carefully positioned lights, its sleek lines still suggesting speed and menace despite decades of stillness. A placard beside it read, "The world's first operational jet fighter. A glimpse of the future delivered too late." Klaus Brandt reached out and touched the fuselage, his fingers trembling slightly. He was 83 years old now, a retired engineer who had spent his post-war career designing civilian aircraft. He'd helped develop passenger jets that carried millions of people safely across oceans, aircraft that landed thousands of times without incident, without fear, without enemy fighters circling overhead. But he'd never forgotten the lesson he'd learned in the winter of 1945. A young curator approached, respectful but curious. "Excuse me, sir. Did you know someone who flew these?" Brandt smiled faintly. "I flew one once, briefly." The curator's eyes widened. What was it like? Brandt considered the question. How could he explain what it felt like to pilot a machine that represented the absolute cutting edge of human achievement, only to discover that cutting edge meant nothing when the fundamentals were ignored? How could he describe the terror of approaching a runway knowing that somewhere above, patient and invisible, an enemy waited with perfect geometry and infinite patience? "It was fast," Brandt said finally. "The fastest thing in the sky. But speed without wisdom is just motion, and motion without destination is just noise." The curator didn't understand. Brandt didn't expect him to. The lesson required context that couldn't be conveyed in a museum, surrounded by artifacts stripped of their terror and consequence. The Me-262 looked magnificent here, a triumph of engineering. It didn't look like a trap. It didn't look like a problem waiting for a solution. Across the Atlantic, in a Veterans Administration hospital in Virginia, Raymond Harris sat in a wheelchair by a window overlooking the parking lot. He was 89 years old, his body failing but his mind still sharp. A physical therapist had left him here an hour ago, promising to return after lunch. Harris didn't mind the wait. He'd learned patience a long time ago. A young resident approached, chart in hand. "Mr. Harris, I was reading your intake form. It says you were a fighter pilot in World War II. Is that right?" Harris nodded slowly. "P-38 Lightning. European theater. Did you shoot anyone down?" The question was innocent, asked without malice or understanding. Harris had been asked variations of it hundreds of times over the decades. The answer was always complicated. 23 confirmed kills, Harris said. Most of them jets, Me-262s. The resident whistled softly. "That's impressive. Those jets were supposed to be unbeatable, right?" "Nothing's unbeatable," Harris replied. "Everything has a weakness. You just have to be patient enough to find it." He thought about the winter of 1945, about the hours spent circling German airfields, waiting for the inevitable moment when physics and fuel consumption forced the enemy into vulnerability. He thought about the discipline required to not chase, to not pursue, to not give in to the adrenaline-fueled urge to engage on the enemy's terms. The hardest part wasn't the fighting, Harris said quietly. It was the waiting. Knowing that if you waited long enough, if you positioned yourself correctly, The enemy would come to you. That required a different kind of courage than the textbooks taught. The resident nodded politely, not understanding, and moved on to the next patient. Harris returned his gaze to the window. Outside, cars came and went, following predictable patterns, obeying traffic signals, landing safely in parking spaces without fear of ambush from above. The world had moved on. The lessons remained. In the archives of the Air Force Historical Research Agency, a dusty file contains the final operational analysis of P-38 operations against Mi-262 bases. The document runs to 300 pages, filled with charts, graphs, intercept vectors, and kill-to-loss ratios. But buried in the appendix is a single paragraph that captures the essence of what happened. The campaign against the Mi-262 demonstrated that modern air warfare is fundamentally a contest of systems rather than machines. The Luftwaffe possessed technological superiority in airframe performance, but failed to address systemic vulnerabilities inherent in jet operations. Allied forces, lacking equivalent technology, achieved air superiority through operational innovation, specifically the exploitation of predictable approach patterns and fuel constraints. This suggests that future air combat doctrine should prioritize systemic thinking over individual platform performance. The paragraph was written by a young captain named John Boyd, who would go on to revolutionize fighter tactics through his energy maneuverability theory. Boyd had studied the P-38 versus Mi-262 engagements obsessively, recognizing that Harris had intuited something fundamental, that combat was about controlling energy states and decision cycles, not about raw speed or firepower. The fork had taught a lesson that echoed through decades of military thought, not through glory or heroism, but through patient, methodical, unglamorous work, the kind of work that wins wars but doesn't make for inspiring stories. In Berlin, at the Deutsches Technikmuseum, a different Mi-262 hangs from the ceiling, suspended in an eternal climb that will never be completed. Tourists photograph it, marvel at its sleek design, imagine the terror and wonder it must have inspired. The placard mentions its speed, its armament, its technical innovations. It doesn't mention the runways. It doesn't mention the fuel consumption. It doesn't mention the patient American pilots circling overhead, waiting for the inevitable descent. Some lessons are too uncomfortable to display in museums. Klaus Brandt died in 2008, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew him as a gentleman who built safe aircraft and told few stories about his war. At his funeral, someone mentioned that he'd been a jet pilot. The younger generation asked what that meant. The older generation changed the subject. Raymond Harris died in 2012, his ashes scattered over the English Channel from a civilian aircraft that followed a predictable approach pattern into Heathrow without fear. His obituary mentioned his distinguished flying cross and his 23 confirmed kills. It didn't mention the waiting. It didn't mention the discipline. It didn't mention the mathematics of patience. But in Air Force academies around the world, instructors still teach the lessons extracted from that winter campaign. They teach cadets to identify systemic vulnerabilities. They teach them to control the variables that matter. They teach them that the most unbreakable walls are not made of steel or speed, but of understanding. They teach them that the fork doesn't chase. It waits. And in waiting, it wins. The Mi-262 was the future, delivered too early to matter. The P-38 was the present, used correctly to decide history. Between them, they wrote a lesson in permanent ink, that wars are won not by those who build the best weapons, but by those who best understand the war they're actually fighting. The fork-tailed devil became an angel of arithmetic. The flying fork became a symbol of patience rewarded. And the jets, for all their speed and beauty and technical magnificence, became a cautionary tale about the difference between capability and victory. In the end, speed was just speed, but discipline was everything. The sky remembers, the runways remember, and somewhere in the mathematics of warfare, the lesson endures. Don't pursue, anticipate. The window always opens, the fork always waits, and history belongs to those who understand the difference.